The engine noise swallowed everything else. I stood in the church parking lot. My leather purse pressed so hard against my chest that the strap dug into my palm. The keys in my hand kept jangling. A small, habitual sound my fingers have made when I'm nervous. And today they felt like a metronome counting out the last beats of something I didn't understand. The bus, the one with the glossy white paint and the chrome mirrors, rolled away slowly then faster. Sunlight bounced off the windshield, blinding me for a moment. I blinked and wiped at my eyes with the back of my knuckles. Diesel smell hung in the air, sharp and oily, mixing with the faint sweetness of Mary Lou's perfume that lingered like a memory. 72 seats. 72 faces I'd sung beside on Sunday mornings. Not one of them mine. It's strange how a single announcement can change the room for you. A month ago Pastor Wilkins stood at that golden pulpit, the light from the stained glass warming his back. He was animated, hands wide. "Think of the footprints of Jesus you'll follow," he said, voice ringing. I felt my heart climb into my throat the way it did when Robert would talk about maps and plans. For 30 years I'd sat on the third pew, the same cushion worn just so. For 30 years my Bible and my life were in that little corner of the sanctuary. Robert used to joke about the promises we'd keep. He loved a promise almost as much as he loved a map. Somehow the promise of Jerusalem had stayed in me after he didn't. After the service, Mary Lou came up close enough that I could have smelled the polish on her nails. Her smile was practiced, the exact slope she used in committee meetings. "Eleanor," she said. Our old bus finally gasped its last. She clicked her tongue, a little like she was trying to make the problem sound theatrical and not catastrophic. "We might have to cancel the pilgrimage." The church office smelled like polished wood and cold air. Pastor Wilkins kept it like a showroom. When I told him I could help, there was an awkward silence. He folded his hands as if in prayer, but his watch caught the light, a small flash of gold, and his smile felt carefully placed. I signed the papers. I remember the paper under my pen, the faint rasp of ink, the coolness of the desk against my forearm. $140,000. My hands trembled. He squeezed my hand and said, "Your name will be on the plaque." I wanted to believe him like I had once believed Robert when he said, "We'll go, love." One day. For 3 weeks I lived like someone who'd been handed a ticket. I renewed my passport with shaking fingers at the post office. The clerk stamped the new passport with a tiny thud that sounded like a starting gun. I ironed dresses, light cotton, modest, and placed them on the back of a kitchen chair so they wouldn't wrinkle. I bought a sun hat and a journal with a soft cover. I read about Jerusalem at night with the table lamp low, the pages smelling like paper and travel. Michael called twice a week. "Grandma, are you serious?" he said, laugh in his voice. Sarah sent pictures of sandals. I could almost hear Robert correcting my packing list in my head. The emails never came. Mary Lou's assurances grew thin, her voice on the phone polite but slippery. "You'll get all the information by email," she said, the words sliding away like someone rinsing a cup. Then came the call from Michael. He was confused, tight. "There's a notice on the church door. The group leaves tomorrow morning." I sat at the kitchen table and the floor felt suddenly too loud. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. I called the church and Mary Lou's voice had a practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "The list is closed, Eleanor. 72 people. Bus is full." Full. I held the receiver and could picture Pastor Wilkins checking a clipboard, watching lists grow in neat columns. I remembered the handshake in his office, the plaque promise. "Your donation was to the church," Mary Lou said, careful now. "Not a personal reservation." She said it the way you tell someone an uncomfortable truth you've been rehearsing. I slept badly. I woke before dawn and put on the outfit I'd planned to wear for the pilgrimage, not to go, but because I needed to feel the fabric. The early morning was a cold, thin light. The neighborhood smelled like wet asphalt and cut grass. My breath came out small puffs that fogged in the air. My car radio was a dull hiss. I turned it off so I could hear myself think. In the church parking lot, the bus was a white island. People moved with the brisk, businesslike energy of a trip about to happen. Suitcases, clipped conversations, goodbyes that were used to shallow sentiment. I made myself step closer. The plaque they'd promised? There was no Eleanor to find. Instead, someone had painted in elegant letters along the side, "Acquired by the grace of God." The words were pretty and anonymous. My chest tightened. The third pew, my pew, was empty in my imagination, the cushion imprinted with me. Pastor Wilkins glanced up from a clipboard. His expression was smooth, as if someone had ironed it. "Eleanor," he said, very measured. "We discussed this at the council." There was no apology in his voice. There was, instead, the easy certainty of someone who believes the script belongs to them. "This is about representation," he added, and I could hear the whole church's patience folded into those two words. Cassandra Miller boarded with a laugh, her 3 girls in tow. The Dr. Thompson, who shows up at holiday services, heaved a suitcase on board. None of them had ever sat in my pew. Nobody called my name. The steps of the bus clanged shut. The engine revved. The keys in my hand stopped jingling. As the bus pulled out and turned the corner, the jangling in my fingers stopped too. The sound of its motor faded, but something else settled in its place. A quietness that was not empty, but clear, like space after you move a piece of furniture and see the mark it left on the rug. I stood there, feeling the sun warm my face and the coolness of the ring on my finger. I wasn't trembling anymore. The clarity felt like a door opening, and I realized I was about to walk through it. The engine noise swallowed everything else. I stood in the church parking lot. My leather purse pressed so hard against my chest that the strap dug into my palm. The keys in my hand kept jangling. A small, habitual sound my fingers have made when I'm nervous. And today they felt like a metronome counting out the last beats of something I didn't understand. My dears, thank you for stopping your day to listen to me. This channel is just starting out, and every new subscriber means more than I can say. It's a small breath of hope. If my story touches you, please click subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. It helps me feel less alone as I share this with you. A month earlier, Pastor Wilkins stood at that golden pulpit and talked about footprints. His hands moved like he was tracing a map in the air. "Think of the footprints of Jesus you'll follow," he said, and light from the stained glass washed his shoulders. I felt my chest lift. Robert had loved maps. He had loved promises. For 30 years I'd taken the third pew like a marker on our map of life. Like a place where vows stuck. After the service, Mary Lou cornered me with a smile that smelled of jasmine. She said the old bus had died. "We might have to cancel the pilgrimage," she said, like it was a bothersome detail. My mouth moved before I thought. "I can help," I told her. The confession felt private, as if I were handing over a letter. I had the life insurance money Robert left, tucked away for emergencies and grandchildren. I never told a soul. But I signed the check. $140,000. I remember the rasp of the pen, the chill of the office air, Pastor Wilkins' fingers over mine as he promised a plaque. For 3 weeks I lived with a ticket in my head. I renewed my passport with trembling hands. I ironed cotton dresses and set them on the chair. I bought a wide-brim hat and a journal with blank pages. I read about Jerusalem by lamplight, letting the words smell like travel. Michael called with that startled young laugh. Sarah sent me pictures of sandals. I packed for a pilgrimage Robert and I had drawn on paper together for years. Then the emails stopped. The church website had a notice. My grandson called. "Grandma, they're leaving tomorrow at 6. My palms went cold. I called Mary Lou. She was careful, polished like a woman reading from a script. "The list is closed, Eleanor. 72 people. The bus is full." Her voice floated over me. "Your donation was to the church, not a personal reservation." She added gently, At your age I gave that money so people could go, I said. My husband and we planned Jerusalem. I thought, it's the church's money now, he said, and then he walked away. I watched people I'd barely known or hardly seen in years board the bus. Cassandra Miller laughed as she lifted her girls' bags. Dr. Thompson hoisted a wheeled suitcase as if this were another holiday. No one called my name. The diesel smelled strong and the engine thrummed like a heart getting ready to leave. The steps clanged shut. The engine revved. The keys in my hand stopped swinging. As the bus turned the corner and the last taillight winked out, a weird calm clarity arrived. The jitters left my hands. The ache in my chest steadied into something like resolve. For decades I had believed that generosity was an offering that bound me to people, to a place. That morning I felt how generosity can be used, like a coin slipped into someone's pocket while they talk. I didn't go back to my pew that Sunday. Instead, I crossed town to the small Methodist church Robert and I had once attended at the beginning of our marriage. The sanctuary smelled of old hymnals and lemon oil. People there nodded at me like we shared a small secret. I held my breath and reached into my purse. I had packed the brochure from a travel agency in my pocket, an organized tour to Israel in August designed for older travelers. I took Michael's hand and Sarah's, and wrote a check for the deposit. It wasn't the grand sanctioned pilgrimage I'd been promised, but it was the promise I'd made to Robert, fulfilled the way I wanted it fulfilled, alongside the faces I loved and trusted. Some journeys are handed to you. Others you build by choosing who walks with you. As the sun warmed the church pews, I felt the weight lift a little, and the map Robert loved spread open, waiting. The morning light in my kitchen always comes in the same way. Soft and a little apologetic, like it doesn't want to startle anything that's been sleeping. It pours through the lace curtains and lays a warm rectangle across the table where I keep Robert's maps folded in a neat stack. The kettle clicks twice and then begins its low, steady whine. Coffee fills the room with that bittersweet smell that feels like a small, reliable prayer. I pour a cup, watch the steam unfurl, and for a minute everything sits right in its place. I am 67. I have lived in this town for most of my life. For 30 years I've sat on the third pew from the front, the cushion molded to my shape. People joke that my name belongs to that seat as much as to my own knuckles, but I've always thought of it as a marker, a little claim stub on the map of my life. The church bells call at 8 on Sunday mornings, a clear, polite sound that makes the air outside smell like cut grass and something holy. I know the cadence of those bells the way a seamstress knows her thread. My days began small after Robert was gone. I tidy the sanctuary before service whenever they let me. Straighten hymnals, dust the brass cross on the altar until it gleams, make the coffee in the fellowship hall. I fold the bulletins the same way each week. People come in and find their places like returning birds. Mary Lou always takes the head table, lipstick immaculate, perfume a little too sweet. The pastor walks in with a practiced breath, Bible under his arm, and the room tilts toward him. We called him Pastor Wilkins then in a way that made his presence feel official. Like a letterhead. His sermons had a cadence that made people lean forward. When he talked about pilgrimages he used his hands as if tracing invisible streets, and light through the stained glass played on his collar. Think of the footprints, he'd say, and I could feel Robert's voice answering in my head, mapping routes and timetables, making promises into plans. There are small things in the sanctuary no one else notices the way I do. The curtain behind the pulpit is a deep burgundy, heavy and warm, like a cloistered room. The altar cloth is white with a faded gold stitch where someone once spilled communion wine. I've mended that stitch twice. Near the cross there's an old wooden box where people drop prayer requests. I have kept a folded note there since Robert died. It's mostly a list of small things I'm grateful for, and a pocket of the promise we made about someday seeing the stones of Jerusalem. Little things anchor you. At home I keep a tin box under the floorboard in the pantry with the papers Robert left me. Life insurance. Some folks know, many do not. I told myself it was for the children, for an emergency, for a quiet dignity. Saying it out loud has never felt necessary, until the bus announcement. When Pastor Wilkins announced the pilgrimage from the pulpit, the church hummed. You could hear it, like someone dropping a spoon in a cup. The stained glass light warmed his cheekbones. I remember the hush that followed him saying, "We will walk where he walked." I felt the chair under me, felt the weight of 30 years of Pew Creek. It landed in me like the scent of the coffee here at dawn, familiar and sudden. I never imagined I'd raise my hand. But later that week, in the office that smells of polished wood and cologne, I found myself opening the tin box and making a phone call. Pastor Wilkins' office is cool, the blinds pulling stripes of light across his carpet. There was a brass plaque on his desk commemorating last year's missions. The letters were crisp and proud. When I placed the check on the desk, my fingers stayed on that paper a beat too long. He took my hand and thanked me like he was closing a covenant. Mary Lou fluttered around us, checking lists, her nails clicking. There were small, hopeful things I did afterward, the kind of preparations people make when a promise becomes real. I opened the travel brochure and left it on the kitchen table so it would be the first thing I saw each morning. I renewed my passport at the post office. The clerk smiled at me with the same small respect reserved for the old. I bought a journal with creamy paper and tucked it beside Robert's maps. At night I read travel guides until my eyelids grew heavy, imagining the sun on my shoulders in a place I had only seen in pictures. But life in a congregation is not just ritual and comfort. It is webs of belonging. I taught Sunday school for decades. I knew faces. I knew secrets that smelled like boiled cabbage and like roses. I had been careful, modest, invisible in ways that people thanked me for with a nod. So when the slip started, the emails that didn't come, the offhand whispers, it sounded wrong in my chest. Mary Lou's voice on the phone became thin, like a thread that had been pulled too tight. "The list is closed," she said once, and the words sat differently than the ones Pastor used when he blessed my check. There was a moment, small, ordinary, when I stood in the sanctuary before service, fingers on the back of my pew, and thought of the little wooden box at the altar. I could almost see the folded note I'd left there for safekeeping. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old hymnals. A pew 2 rows up was empty, oddly empty, as if someone had stood up mid-sentence and walked away. Felt like a prelude. I have always believed that giving is prayer in action. I believed the plaque Pastor promised would say my name, quiet and proud. I believed too that a promise to Robert would keep a place open for me. Now, hours before they would call the roll and board that bus, the house is very still. The kettle has cooled. Outside, the church bell rings 3 soft notes, later than usual, as if time is trying to make up its mind. I fold my hands around my cup and taste the coffee, bitter and honest, and I try to make my heart do the same. The pastor's office smelled like polished wood and something faintly citrus, the same smell it had the day I handed over that check. I could feel the paper under my fingers even now, the impression of my pen, the weight of the number. When I walked back into the sanctuary that morning, the air felt different, as if someone had shifted the furniture in a room I thought I knew. I waited until the end of the last prayer. People were hugging, talking in small knots, breath warm and full of plans. My palms were slick inside my gloves. The keys in my pocket were a small, useless metronome. I told myself I would be polite. I would not raise my voice. I would simply ask, where was my name? Mary Lou's perfume hit me first, jasmine and something sharp. She smiled her practiced smile and reached for my hand as if we were at a committee meeting. "Eleanor," she said, too bright. "The bus?" She checked a small tablet like it owned her attention. Her smile never faltered. It was what she wore to make decisions look gentle. "Is there a problem with the list?" I asked. My voice felt thin like thread pulled across an edge. She hesitated just the tiniest bit. That was all the space Pastor Wilkins needed when he joined us, clipboard under his arm, his tie knotted exactly the way he liked it. He looked familiar and foreign at the same time. I could see his watch blink gold in the light. The keys in my pocket suddenly felt too heavy. I dug them out with a trembling hand and let them rattle once, hopelessly. "I gave that money so people could go," I said. "Robert and he loved maps. We—" My voice broke on the last word. I could feel every face in the small crowd, a scattering of interest and awkwardness. No one seemed surprised to be where they were. Not surprised to leave me where I stood. Mary Lou's smile thinned into a practiced condolence. "Your donation was to the church, Eleanor. Not a personal reservation." She spoke slowly, as if explaining to someone who'd misplaced a shoelace. "And well, given your blood pressure and your age, perhaps this isn't the best trip for you." The room tilted. For a second the hymnals on the shelf blurred. My hands went cold. The pulse in my wrist beat loud in my ear. I could smell the diesel outside, sharp and oily like an animal scent catching up with me. The word age landed like a small stone in my chest and rolled around until it lodged. "Who's on the list?" I asked, quieter now. I needed names, faces, any crack to let light through. He read them off like he was clearing his throat. Cassandra Miller, 3 children, Dr. Thompson, members of the missions committee. People I'd seen at bazaars and potlucks. People who hardly sat in the same pew as I did. I listened to the names as if they were a litany. None of them had ever sat beside me on Sunday for long councils. None had been in my kitchen the way some people had been over 30 years. When I stepped out into the parking lot, the morning air hit my face like a hand. The bus stood there white and confident, its chrome catching the sun. Someone had painted "Acquired by the Grace of God" along the side in those looping commemorative letters Pastor had promised would include my name. There was no brass plaque. There was no Eleanor. There was only the smooth anonymity of a phrase that sounded holy and impersonal. The engine was warming up. Luggage clattered. People laughed in the way of people who were about to go somewhere important. I watched Cassandra lift her daughters into the step. Her laugh sounded like a bell. Dr. Thompson rolled a suitcase with a practiced, indifferent shove. My breath fogged in the cool air. I felt the ring on my hand, the metal warm against my skin. "Eleanor," Pastor Wilkins said, passing me without looking back. "We'll pray for you while we're away." Those words, offered like a bandage, did not settle. They slid off the curve of the morning. I watched the steps clang shut. The engine revved, a low living sound. 72 faces leaned out of windows, bright and expectant. Not one of them turned my way. As the bus pulled away, a small, precise silence opened in me. The jangling of my keys stopped. The diesel smell thinned. I could feel the shape of what had happened like a bruise. My generosity moved into the world, useful and necessary for others, but my place on the map had been redrawn without me. For a heartbeat I expected the bitterness to swallow me. Instead, a kind of cool clarity came. My hands stopped shaking. The knot in my throat loosened into something like a hinge. I thought of Robert's maps folded in the tin box under the pantry floor. I thought of promises we kept to each other. The soft, private vows that sit like seeds ready to sprout. I didn't follow the bus. I stood until its taillights were gone and the morning sounds returned. A lawn mower down the street, a dog barking 2 houses over. Then I turned my keys over in my palm and drove across town to the little Methodist church Robert and I had loved at the start of our marriage. The sanctuary there smelled of old hymnals and lemon oil, and when I walked in, people looked up and nodded as if I'd been expected. In my purse I had slipped the brochure from a travel agency. It was plain, printed on thin paper. Israel August Seniors Group. I took Michael's hand, then Sarah's, and told them what I intended. Their faces were open, steady. I wrote a deposit on the brochure with hands that felt unfettered, and for the first time that morning I was moving towards something I chose, not something decided for me. When I left that small church, the map in my head unfolded a little wider. The road to Jerusalem was still there. I would keep the promise. I would walk the stones with those I loved, by the promise Robert and I had made together. The bus that took the congregation had left the parking lot, but it had also cleared the path for a decision I hadn't known I was ready to make. The engine noise filled the lot like a wall. My keys kept jangling in my hand, a tiny honest sound that had always steadied me. Today they sounded like an accusation. I walked closer until the bus's chrome mirrors threw my face back at me. Pale paper-thin, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered. Diesel and the faint sweetness of Mary Lou's perfume braided in the air. She found me first, her smile already in place. Her hand reached for mine. Nails lacquered, the gesture practiced. Up close I could see the little tightened line at the corner of her mouth when she smiled too wide. "Eleanor," she said, voice syrup smooth. "We're all set." She glanced at the bus as if it were someone's prize. Her eyes flicked past me, not landing. "I don't understand," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to another woman. "My name isn't on the list." Mary Lou's fingers tightened around her tablet like a talisman. For a beat she hesitated, and in that pause Pastor Wilkins stepped forward, clipboard under his arm, the clipped edge of his hand like an emblem. His watch caught the sun, a quick, indifferent gold. He looked at me with that even calm he reserves for announcements. "Eleanor," he said, slow and measured. The word had no warmth. "We discussed this at the council." The council. The sound of it was a small stone dropped into a still pool. I remembered his hand covering mine in his office, the paper under my pen, the cool desk. I could see the pen scratch like a photograph in my head. My name on the check, the numbers aligned, Robert's handwriting in a note folded inside my purse. My throat tightened. "You told me my name would be on the plaque," I said. The words came out thin. My fingers found the ring on my hand and turned it, the metal warm and solid against my palm. Pastor Wilkins' smile was the kind that has been practiced in mirrors. "Your generous donation is to the ministry, Eleanor. This pilgrimage is about representation. We choose those who best represent our congregation." Represent. The word slid off his tongue like a coin. His eyes didn't stay with mine. They were already moving through his list. I felt small and ridiculous and raw all at once. Mary Lou's perfume was suddenly too sweet, cloying, and I remembered her nails clicking on the committee table as they counted votes. "I gave that money so people could go," I said, quieter. "So my husband's promise," my voice caught. The photo of Robert's map, folded and creased, flashed in my head. His blue pen circling routes, his laugh when we imagined walking the old stones together. "It's church property now," Mary Lou said, almost kindly. Her smile softened into something that looked like sympathy. "Not a personal reservation." She leaned in, lowering her voice as if she were keeping a secret. "And, Eleanor, considering your blood pressure and your age, perhaps this trip would be too strenuous." The age landed like an edge. I felt the blood back of my neck flush and then go cold. Someone behind me said something, a fragment of a farewell, and the sound hollowed out. I watched Pastor Wilkins flip a page of his clipboard with a small immaculate motion and say, "We'll pray for you while we're away. Pray for you." The words had the shape of a benediction and the weight of a door closing. I tried to breathe. I tried to name faces. Cassandra Miller laughed as she shoved a small suitcase into the bus bay. Her 3 girls clustered close, their skirts bright and new. Dr. Thompson, who shows up for holidays and baptisms, rolled his suitcase on silent wheels like a man whose life is wrapped in convenience. None of them had sat in my pew. None had ever shared my kitchen at autumn potlucks. Their faces were bright, expectant, strangers in places I thought only belonged to me. The bus steps clanged shut. The engine hummed like a contained animal. My keys stopped their tick-tick. For a long second I expected the breath of bitterness to take me under. It didn't. Instead something clearer came, sharp and steady, like cold water on the back of the hand. I remembered the night I had signed the papers, the pastor's office cooler than the church, the brass plaque gleaming on his desk, Paul's hands over mine. I remembered the small thrill of possibility. On the drive across town I rehearsed small defiant things, a letter? A complaint? But my hands on the steering wheel remembered something kinder. I thought of Robert's maps folded in the tin box under the pantry floor, and of the promises you make to people, and keep even when the world rearranges itself. By the time I pulled into the little Methodist church, my decision had settled like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of old hymnals and lemon oil, simple and honest. People looked up and nodded. Their welcome felt like an old quilt. Michael took my hand, his fingers solid, warm. Sarah's eyes were wide and steady, her notebook forgotten at her side. "Grandma," Michael said, voice low, protective, "we'll go with you." I opened my purse and took out a crumpled travel brochure I'd tucked there on a sudden impulse. Israel, August Seniors Group. It read in plain print. I felt my pulse even as I felt a strange, new lightness. I wrote a deposit with hands that no longer trembled the way they had in Pastor Wilkins' office. The promise to Robert didn't need a plaque or a council vote. It needed me, and it needed the faces I trusted. As I signed, I could feel the smell of coffee and lemon oil fill the room. The map Robert loved unfolded in my mind. Roads and stones and a path that, finally, I would choose who I walked with. The first Sunday after the bus left, the sanctuary felt smaller. I could feel it the moment I turned onto Maple Street. A little less humming in the air, like someone had taken the thread from a sweater and left a thin bare line. I parked where I always did, hands folded in my lap for a minute, listening to the engine tick and the ice in my water bottle clink. The church doors were open, the same wide oak with the brass kickplate, but when I pushed my hand against the wood it closed a little harder than I remembered. Inside, the fellowship hall smelled the same. Coffee, lemon oil, the faint dust sweet of old hymnals. But the voices were lower. Conversations that used to float up around the coffee urn now tightened into short sentences and sideways glances. I walked in with the same instinct that has always guided me. To fold bulletins, straighten hymnals, tuck a folded little note into the prayer box, and everything I reached for seemed to move an inch away. "Morning, Eleanor," Mary Lou said from across the room. Her smile clipped into a neat half-moon. She set a plate of cookies on the table with a little flourish, as if to show me the work had already been done. Her perfume curved into the space between us, sweet and sharp like citrus and too much. There was no warmth in her eyes. Behind her, Mrs. Gable shifted her chair so our hips would not line up on the same bench. A small thing, but it looked deliberate. I went to the pew anyway. Habit is a stronger muscle than hurt. I ran my fingers over the worn spot where my knee usually rests, feeling the familiar indentation like a passport stamp. A woman I'd shared casseroles with last winter crossed to the other side of the aisle when she saw me, a hymn book held like a shield. A young couple I'd baptized 3 summers ago avoided my eye entirely. The man bowed his head and fiddled with the pages as if reading new words. Whispers followed me like draft air. They were not loud enough to be names, only syllables, pieces. She gave the money. I heard she expected a plaque. Didn't she know? The words slid over me, collecting on my shoulders like lint. At the coffee table someone leaned in and spoke in a tone I have heard at funeral receptions. Practice sympathy wrapping a complaint. I could not catch all of it, and in that not catching the mind can invent a worse thing than was ever said. The bulletin board by the kitchen had always been a small map of lives. Birthdays, the choir rehearsal schedule, the volunteer list. That morning a new roster sat where my name used to be, "Welcome Team" in neat print, with a different handwriting that had once been mine. My name wasn't crossed out. It had simply been left off. I stood there for a moment and traced the edge of the paper with my thumb, because moving felt better than standing still. The pastor's sermon was gentle that day, about servanthood and the joys of giving. His voice washed over the congregation like warm water. I listened, hearing how words can be made into windows or doors. After the benediction, people moved with a new choreography. Handshakes had been rehearsed with a distance in them. Hugs were offered and withdrawn quickly. I lingered near the exit, hoping for someone to catch my eye and offer a question, an apology, a small courtesy. A child I used to teach barreled past and nearly knocked into me. He didn't even apologize. His mother pulled him on faster, her eyes set on the floor until we were out of range. Small exclusions piled into a pattern. I used to tidy the communion table. The next week I arrived early and found a neat linen already laid. Fresh flowers arranged by someone else. My apron was folded on a chair I didn't recognize. The children's choir director sent a message thanking me for years of help and inviting me to visit during practice. A polite distance that felt like an open door someone had left ajar but latched from the inside. Calls that once came every other day. Requests to fill in, reminders of meetings, invitations to bake, slowed to rare drops. The civic rhythms we'd shared for decades began to miss my beat. When I stopped by the church office to drop off a stack of hymnals, the receptionist smiled and said, "We're really strapped for volunteers right now." Sounded like an excuse. Sounded like distance. I do not pretend nothing hurt. The tightness in my chest was real. There were moments I wanted to knock on doors and demand a reason, to hold them accountable for the way they had rearranged a life without telling me. But anger and I have a complicated path. It leaves me tired. Instead, I learned to notice the small ways people shut themselves. Someone closing a door a beat earlier than necessary. A head turn just before our eyes would meet. Coffee poured into paper cups rather than the mugs I'd brought for 2 decades. What surprised me most was how quickly the sanctuary reconfigured itself without me. Chairs shifted. Roles moved like pieces on a chessboard. And the more people moved, the emptier the spaces felt. Not loud emptiness, quiet domestic absence, like an unlit room where the lamp used to be. At home that night I set Robert's maps on the table, and smoothed a page with fingers that remembered his pen. The house felt softer somehow. I do not say that to be dramatic. There was a kind of clearing. When something in the world rearranges you without asking, you either break beneath it or you find a way to walk through the new doorway. I could feel the press of neighbors' opinions. I could feel the church's weight. But I could also feel my own hands, steady, familiar, tucking a journal into my bag. Michael had texted that morning. "We'll come by Sunday. Don't be alone." Those 3 words settled like a first coat of paint. The next morning a neighbor's dog barked at the fence and then ran back to its yard. Across the street, the church bell chimed like a question. I folded a clean handkerchief, put it in my pocket and walked out the front door. The doors of the sanctuary might be closed to me in ways they hadn't been before. But the world still had sidewalks, and there were other doors that would open when I stepped up to them. The sanctuary felt too loud, the way a room full of folding chairs sounds when someone drags one back and everyone notices. Pastor Wilkins' voice rolled out from the pulpit. Rich, practiced, the cadence he uses when he wants people leaning forward. "We must honor the work God is doing through this congregation." His words filled the hall and bounced off the wood like a bell. The varnish on the pulpit smelled warm and faintly of lemon oil. It ought to have been comforting. Instead it felt like an accusation. My hands were folded so tight that the knuckles went white. I kept telling myself to breathe slowly. In out. In out. The metal of my wedding ring dug into my palm, and that small pressure steadied me for a moment. Around us, voices softened to the hush that comes before a benediction. Children sat very still. The stained glass light spilled a thin strip of color across the hymnals. Everything looked holy and ordinary, until it didn't. There was a candle on the altar, one of those unscented tapers they light for travel prayers. It trembled in a draft I couldn't place, its flame leaning as if listening for something. Mary Lou stood near the back, poised and bright as usual, clipboard in hand. Pastor's words rolled on. Representation, stewardship, ministry's call. And I felt the air thicken like steam against glass. I told myself I would be calm. I interlaced my fingers in my lap until the skin of my palms ached. My breath was slow and contained, a deliberate measure. I practiced answers and my throat tightened. I thought of the brass pen scratching my check 3 weeks ago, of the cool desk in his office, of the little thrill that had lived in me when he promised a plaque. I had pictured my name small and sure on a metal plate. Now his voice reshaped that picture into something else. Your generous donation is to the ministry, he said. Not a personal reservation. He tilted his head as if explaining an arithmetic problem to a child. And given your health, your blood pressure, this pilgrimage might be too much. I felt the room narrow around the word age, like an old door closing a fraction. My fingers unwound from their knot. I forced a breath, but it came short. The candle on the altar flickered violently, as if something in the building had shifted. For a heartbeat it stretched tall and bright. Then the flame guttered and went out. The tiny hiss of air seemed enormous. Someone coughed. A choir member rustled her music. I watched Pastor Wilkins move on his clipboard, as if moving on would make it less true. Mary Lou's smile hardened into something almost polite. We'll pray for you while we're gone, she offered, the phrase heavy with a finality that felt like a door being locked. I tried to hold myself like the third pew I'd sat in for decades, steady, familiar, a thing people could rely on. My hand found my keys in my purse. The coolness of the metal steadied me a second. I made a small, ridiculous motion of clearing my throat, the way you do when you want to be heard without shouting. Pastor, I said, and my voice stayed low. My name on the plaque. His eyes slid past me. Eleanor. The decision was pastoral, and the list is closed. The crucifix that hung on the small stand beside the pulpit, an old brass one they'd used during youth retreats, tilted as someone bumped the lectern. It came loose with a tiny, mundane sound and clattered on the floor between us, spilling from its place like an answer pushed off a table. For a moment everything stilled. The little brass cross lay askew, catching the light like a question. Nobody rushed. No one looked to pick it up. It was as if the clatter belonged to a different house. I felt something inside me click into place. An odd, terrible clarity that showed me the scene in lines I had not let myself see. The plaque that was promised, the letters that would bear my name. Maybe they were never meant to be about me at all. Maybe my money had been folded into budgets and votes and representation, until the person who'd written the checks did not exist in the ledger. The fellowship hall door creaked as someone closed it with a long, solvent sound, and then the diesel smell rose from outside like a tide. I walked out into the parking lot because the waiting felt too much. The bus waited, white and solemn, chrome mirrors catching the morning sun. People hoisted luggage, laughter packing into the air like confetti. Cassandra Miller's girls tumbled up the steps. Dr. Thompson rolled his bag with the bored efficiency of someone used to being accommodated. I stood at the edge of it all with my keys in my hand and watched the steps clang shut. The engine revved, a low animal sound. The little cross on the pulpit sat on the pavement where someone had left it after the bus left. A small metallic tilt in the concrete. The candle in the sanctuary had gone out. A wick and a smear of wax were all that remained. As the bus pulled away, I felt the jangling of my keys stop. The sound the keys made in my hand had been a metronome of anxiety for weeks. It stopped, and with it my trembling. The diesel smell thinned. The noise of the engine retreated down Maple Street, and 72 faces leaned out of windows, bright, expectant, none of them turning to look for me. For a moment the ache in my chest opened into something else. It wasn't just loss. It was a clear line drawn through the map I'd carried. The flame had gone out. The cross had fallen. Something had been revealed by its falling. I stood in the sunlight until the bus was a white dip, then a smudge. My palms relaxed around the keys. The ring on my finger was warm against my skin. I breathed in, slow and deliberate. The sanctuary doors, the pulpit, the people I'd loved, they were still there. But the path they wanted me on was no longer the one I would walk. I did not clean the wax or retrieve the cross. I let them lie where they had fallen. The clarity felt like a small hard gift. I turned my face to the sun and walked away. When the bus was gone, the lot smelled like diesel and warm rubber. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The radio turned off so the car could be nothing but the sound of my breathing. The house was the same. The kettle, the maps folded on the table, the soft dent in the third pew of the couch where Robert used to sit while making plans. I set my purse down, sank into the chair, and let the silence move through me like a tide. I told myself I needed to sort papers. It was an ordinary task, the kind that keeps the world from tipping. I got down on my knees in the pantry and eased up the loose board where the tin box had lived for years. The lid stuck for a breath and then lifted with the small, familiar scrape of metal against wood. Inside were the usual things. The insurance papers, an old receipt from the travel agency Robert liked to keep, a folded grocery list with his handwriting on it. I had looked at these papers 100 times and never seen them differently. Today, when I unfolded the smallest scrap of paper, the handwriting reached out and opened something in my chest. It was his small, tidy loops, the way he drew his Ys almost like an arrow. Eleanor, it read. If I go before you, don't let anyone tell you how to keep a promise to yourself. Go where you're meant and go with who makes you smile. R. The note was short. The paper was yellow at the crease. Something about the way his ink had bled into the fibers made his voice present in the room. The same gentle correction he used when I misfolded a map. The same half-laugh when he'd say, "We'll get there eventually, love." The words were not a miracle. They were a small human thing he'd left me. A permission tucked into the ledger of our lives. I sat back on my heels and let that permission settle. For months I had been trying to make the world follow the map Robert and I had drawn. For months I'd believed that buying a bus would make a promise literal, that money could be stamped with my name and the trip would be mine. But the note reminded me of a different truth. Promises are not always kept by the people you expect, and generosity isn't a ticket. It was then that I felt the tightness in my chest loosen into something like room. I could still feel the echo of Pastor Wilkins' clipped voice, Mary Lou's perfume, the bus's engine in the distance. I could feel the absence of a plaque. All of that was true. So was the note in my hand. They could both exist without canceling each other. That realization was not tidy. It was a hinge. I made the call to Michael with my thumb still smudged by the pencil lead Robert always left in his pockets. He answered on the third ring, sleepy and surprised when I told him to pack a bag. "Are you sure, Grandma?" he asked. "Not only sure," I said, hearing Robert in my own voice. "I'm certain." We went to the little Methodist church that afternoon because it smelled like lemon oil and honest things. The people there didn't rearrange when I walked in. They welcomed me the way you invite someone to sit at the table. No ceremony, only warmth. I handed the travel brochure to Michael and Sarah and watched their faces read the map in the paper like they had always been capable of it. They held my hands the way people steady one another before stepping off a curb. When I wrote the deposit, my hand didn't tremble. The numbers, the ink, they were simple tools. They could start a trip. They could also be the act of keeping a vow in the only way that mattered, by choosing who walks with you. In the weeks that followed, I learned that clarity is not a light switch. It arrives in small things. A packed suitcase, the scent of sunscreen, Michael's hand in mine when we practiced walking with backpacks in the park. Friends from the Methodist church offered advice about pacing and sun hats. Neighbors asked questions and listened. Church bells still rang on Sundays where I had sat for decades, but their sound no longer felt like a measure of my belonging. It became simply the sound of a town keeping time. People asked me later if I felt bitter. I did for a while. A sharp, honest bitterness that sat with me like an uninvited guest. But it didn't live there forever. The note from Robert had been a small, steady current that pulled me toward something softer than revenge. It pulled me toward the promise we'd made in private, toward the idea that the most sacred pilgrimages are the ones you choose to take with people who know the weight of your hand. On the morning the three of us finally left, I wore the dress I had ironed weeks ago and the hat I'd bought. The sun felt right on my shoulders. Michael folded the maps. Some promises require witnesses. Others only require courage. I stepped into the car with Michael and Sarah, and when we pulled away, the map in my lap did not feel like a demand. Felt like a road. The third pew felt smaller than I remembered. I stood on the threshold for a long time, the sunlight through the stained glass making colors on the floor like a page someone had folded back. It smelled the way it always had, lemon oil and old hymnals, except now there was a thin edge to it, like a window left cracked in winter. My hand found the worn spot where my knee used to rest, and I traced the dent with a fingertip as if reading a braille I had memorized. No one asked me to sit. No one reached out a hand. The space was the same but different, as if someone had rearranged the furniture in a room while I was away. A coffee cup steamed on a tray in the fellowship hall. Someone had placed it there with perfect rehearsed kindness. A hymn book lay open, a ribbon caught at a page I knew by heart. I felt the weight of decades press and then ease, like an old coat put on and slipped off. I could have stayed. For a moment I imagined myself folding the bulletin, smoothing the edge of the pew, slipping the small scrap of Robert's handwriting back into the tin box. It would have been tidy. It would have been the shape of the life I had expected to keep. But tidy is not always honest, and I had learned, over a single hot morning and the slow scraping away that came after, that honesty asks for different things. My keys were a small metronome in my hand, metal that always clicked when I was nervous. I turned them over until the ring warmed against my palm. The ring felt like an old compass. The maps Robert used to keep lay folded on my kitchen table, the creases soft from being opened and closed. His handwriting was there still, a tiny arrow pointing at a route. I had read it so many times that his voice lived in the paper, instructing and forgiving all at once. Don't let anyone tell you how to keep a promise to yourself. I sat for a minute and listened. The sanctuary held 100 quiet things. The scrape of a chair leg, the rustle of a jacket, the soft footfall of someone moving down the aisle. The sound of footsteps is its own kind of liturgy. They came and they went. They belonged to people who were moving toward the bus, toward plans not meant for me. They also belonged to people who would stay, who would notice the empty pew and learn, slowly, to live around the absence. Outside, the lot had the clean, new smell of rubber and diesel where the bus had once waited. The place where it had stood felt like a scar smoothed by time. I could see the shadow of its mirror on the pavement as if it had left a print. The words painted on its side, acquired by the grace of God, looked pretty because a word can be prettied and still be small. Some pretty words mean nothing to the hands that write checks, and some promises are kept only in private. I left without a fuss. My steps crossed the threshold slow, deliberate. The wooden door made a soft, final sound when it closed behind me. A small, polite clap like somebody closing a book. The wind met it there. A draft that slid along the threshold and sent a small shiver through the pages of a roadside bulletin pinned near the door. The wind smelled like cut grass and something bright, like the edge of a peach. As I walked away, I noticed the footfalls change. Where there had been a chorus of hurried packing, there was now a single, even sound, my shoes on the pavement. It was not loud. It was not meant to be heard. It was the sound of a woman moving toward something chosen rather than allotted. With each step the shape of the morning shifted a little, tightness releasing into room. I thought of small stubborn things. A hat packed in the back of the closet, a journal with blank pages, Michael's laugh when he confirmed he'd come. I thought of Sarah taking notes like she always does, recording the small miracles of daylight. I thought of Robert's handwriting, of the way he had circled a route and underlined a place like he was pointing out a prayer. Those were the anchors I could take with me. At the end of the block, the breeze picked up in a scrap of paper, some lost page from someone's list, lifted and spun along the curb. It moved so easily, rolling once and coming to rest against a drain. I stooped and picked it up without thinking. It was nothing important. A grocery item crossed out, A phone number jotted and half-smudged. Felt like permission. The church door side shut behind me. The sound was small, domestic, the kind of finality that is not dramatic but absolute. It folded the morning behind it like a hand closing a book. The bell didn't ring for me that day. It rang for others. Somewhere down the street a child laughed, and the laugh sounded like a promise I recognized. I walked to my car and slid the maps into my lap like a small altar. The paper was warm from the sun through the windshield. I folded my fingers around the steering wheel, and felt the metal of my ring steady against my palm. There was an ache, of course there was, but under it something new had room to breathe. When the wind tucked itself around the oak door and it swung to, the sound it made had a quiet dignity. It told me plainly that one chapter had ended. It also held the space for another to begin. I slid the key in the ignition and for the first time in a long while, I moved with the map that I had chosen. The empty pew would stay empty for a while. The light through the stained glass would still make colors on the floor. Those things would remain and they would mean what they meant. But the path beyond the church's doors waited, sunlit, patient, and I walked toward it with 2 hands and 2 hearts beside me. The steps behind me faded, and the wind closed the door. The kettle clicks off and the room smells like coffee and paper. I fold the travel brochure again, the creases familiar, and the maps Robert loved lie open on the kitchen table like a small worldly altar. Sunlight dusts the paper with a warm edge. My fingers trace his handwriting, little circles, a crooked arrow, until the ink feels like a voice I can reach. For months I believed that generosity would be a chain, one link fastened to another until my place was obvious. Instead, my giving loosened threads I thought were woven through me. They used my money to fix a problem, to buy a bus that carried other people's names. They painted "acquired by the grace of God" in looping letters and left my name off the metal. That omission is a bruise that still colors me sometimes. But bruises heal into maps of where you have been. I replay the morning as a string of small sounds. The clipboard's paper whisper. Pastor Wilkins' watch catching the sun. Mary Lou's perfume too sweet and close. The clank of the bus steps. The diesel exhale swallowing the lot. My keys stopped jangling the second the bus turned the corner. The silence after that sound was not empty. It was a clearing. People in the church rearranged themselves like furniture when someone moves out. Roles shifted. Invitations shrank. Hugs became quick, careful transactions. I felt it, little exclusions as precise as measured cuts. It hurt. It still surprises me how a community can forget the contours of a person whose life it once matched like a seam. And yet, there was tenderness beyond the loss. Michael and Sarah came like a steady tide. They folded into the map with easy certainty, their hands warm around mine as we wrote the deposit. The small Methodist church, lemon oil, hymnals, plain faces, welcomed the way a kitchen table invites you to sit. There were no brass plaques, no ribbon cuttings. Just hands and routes and the slow, honest work of planning. Robert's note lives in a tin box under the pantry floor. I took it out the morning after the bus left. His handwriting is a small counsel. Don't let anyone tell you how to keep a promise to yourself. That line settled into me like a choice. It reminded me that vows we make in private carry at least as much holiness as those placed on a podium. Faith, I've learned, is not always located in congregational approval. There is a faith that asks you to stay, to accept folded corners, and there is a faith that asks you to move, to choose your companions for the road. I do not reject the church because the people acted poorly. I refuse to let their choices define the limits of my promises. There are afternoons now when I take the maps out and feel the paper seam. I pack a hat into a bag, then a journal with blank leaves. I practice walking with a small backpack in the park so my knees remember the motion. Michael tests the zippers and jokes about my sunscreen. Sarah annotates the guidebook in careful looping script. Their laughter fills the house the way sunlight fills a basin, soft, steady, not loud but everywhere. When I close my eyes I can see the bus, white chrome polished, turning down Maple Street. I can feel the tiny, precise sting of being left out. That truth sits beside another. The warm, fierce certainty of choosing who. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.